Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin, and I'm here to look for reliable signals and filter out all the nonsense that you typically find in politics.
I'm Jonathan, and as coming from a professor's angle, I like to look for causes and understand what's going on, sort of the underlying reasons. Today, we're really lucky to have an interview. One of Justin's friends is a canvasser for the Democratic Party, and he's going to. We recorded that a couple days ago. He's going to really give us some interesting insights into what's going on the ground. Before we get that, thought I would mention the beer I have for the week. I have Heady Topper, which is the OG hazy IPA from New England. Right, it was on my beer list that I really wanted to try for a long time, and we were very fortunate to start getting it in Colorado. You'll notice probably that I did not pour it into a glass, as they recommend right on the can. Drink it from the can. Being me, I had to test that out one time. It is actually better in the can. You get a little less in terms of aroma, but the fizz is just better and more lively when it's in the can rather than pouring it in a glass first. The taste, I mean, it's how I want to have a New England IPA. It's got some of the tropical and the fruity stuff in the hops and in the aroma that you can get through the can, but it's not sweet. And that's the New England IPAs that veer into the sweet are the things that put me off. This one still has a big hops background of bitterness and resin and things like that to make it, you're drinking an IPA, and enough malt to kind of back up the alcohol. This is about 8%, so it's a strong New England IPA, really good stuff. I heartily recommend, if you see Heady Topper, just like when you see Pliny the Elder, buy both of those. Those are really good beers.
Yeah, gotta love it when it's 8%. Well, after the interview, I think it would be nice to take a break from all the anxiety about the presidential election. So we're going to talk about the House race, where, it's still pretty much a coin flip, but I think there are some things that we should analyze there. And sometimes it's just nice to take a break.
We'll go by the old axiom: don't panic. There'll always be time to panic later, right? And probably all we can do right now. There will be certainly more data next week as we get ready to prepare for the election. But the House race is interesting, and I think you're right that we need to take a look at it before we get completely bogged down and wrapped up in the last throes of the presidential election.
So for our first interview, it's split up into two parts. We're going to talk about the actual aspects of canvassing and, what it means to canvass and, what kind of data they deal with. And then we're going to talk about Jon's experience when it comes to canvassing Pennsylvania specifically. So stay tuned. Okay, so now we're going to go into our first interview with an old friend of mine, Jon Wong. He is a freelance canvasser for the Democrats right now, and I heard you just got done canvassing in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
That is correct. I was just there on Saturday.
All right. So why don't you tell us what a canvasser does?
Yeah, so a canvasser, basically, they go door to door talking to voters. Usually it's a targeted list of voters that a campaign gives you, and you go out and have conversations with these voters if they answer the door.
So I have to ask, how often does the door get shut in your face?
Depends where you are and the people. Depends also campaign to campaign cycle. Some years are rough and some years are like, actually this year I've had maybe 2 doors total, which actually honestly is not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds really good.
So how targeted is the canvassing? I mean, do they want you just to speak to Democrats, or do they send you out to talk to independents as well? Is it persuasive or more get out the vote kind of stuff?
Yeah, thank you for teeing that up for me. So as someone who has also been an organizer, worked on different campaigns, I can't tell what the Republicans do in their targeting, but basically when it comes to campaigns, there's kind of naturally 2 different cycles that you in terms of reaching out to voters, whether it's door knocking / canvassing, phone banking, etc. Usually, the initial part is what's called the persuasion universe, which basically you're talking to more independents, talking to potentially, as for the Democrats, possible Republicans and other third party voters that might be supportive, and then Democrats who may be less reliable voters that might need to hear your messaging more. And usually that happens, especially in the summer. Granted, this year it was a little bit tighter given that Kamala Harris didn't become the presumptive nominee until July. So that was much tighter.
Mm.
And usually it transitions September into October into what's called Get Out the Vote, which is the turnout part. Basically, you're trying to get supporters that you have already identified through the persuasion time, plus people that are based on their voting pattern, Democrats who reliably turn out to make sure that they get out to vote and make sure that they have a plan to vote, whether it's to mail in their ballot or whether it's to go on election day. So those are kind of like the two phases of voter outreach.
How effective do you think these sort of approaches usually are?
I think they're reasonably effective. I mean, not everything is foolproof, and obvious.
Sure.
And Jonathan, as you know, as a political scientist, sometimes the data is not always clean cut because usually voters who are targeted in certain ways are getting multiple different stuff. So even a lot of studies, right? Like basically, um, there are some effects, but like the reality is that like a voter that you target in one way might be outreached and messaged in another way that could potentially affect. But you can't really, it's in the height of the campaign, so you can't really kind of extract these individually, right? Um, that said, I do think it's fairly uh, effective, but obviously it costs a lot of money to do these kind of voter outreach, because the reality is there's a lot of like first time people who go like door knocking and canvassing, and they're like, oh wow, there's like not a lot of people home, and the reality is that a good canvas rate, as in like a good rate of like people you talk to, is typically around 20% of the doors you knock. Most of the doors you knock, they're not going to answer and stuff like that. Actually, part of the reason why there's less people slamming your face now, I think, is because we've got a cornucopia of, say, Ring cameras. So people can know who you are already, and they can tell whether they want to like open the door for you or not. And obviously, if like they are more reticent to open the door, they can talk to you like through their like doorbell that also has a camera and like a speaker as well. So anyways, I would say that it is effective, but also that it does take a lot of work and a lot of volunteers and time, because ultimately to reach voters and to get your message across, it takes a lot of time and a lot of repeating, and sometimes going to that same door 5, 6, 7 times in the campaign, hoping that you'll talk to them maybe once or twice.
Yeah, I imagine that, if you look at like two axes, right? Like on one axis you would have effort and the other axis you'd have effectiveness. I imagine canvassing is right there in the top corner, right? It's high effort, but also highly effective. Where something like, mass mailing, it might not be particularly effective, but the effort's pretty, little. Where would you say that, phone banking is, or like texting outreach, things like that? Like where would it be along that curve?
Yeah, they're more middling. I mean, Jonathan would be the one who has like that kind of probably the data in past kind of research, but I would say they're kind of in the middling, right? Because I think the reason why canvassing is more effective because it is literally face to face in person. It's easier to build a conversation, and you're not like rushed for time generally, and you're able to build a more authentic connection. That said, there's different ways people canvassing stuff. Some people are just really collecting data and not really like being persuasive, and then some people really like there's organizations beyond the campaign that do a nerdy thing called deep canvassing. And what deep canvassing really means is that during like during an either an early phase of an election or in a non-election time period, go talk to voters about like different issues and different stuff to like basically get the prime the conversation to hopefully move toward the direction you want them to hopefully support. Um, so I would say that text banking and phone banking, because they're kind of less face to face. I mean, obviously you're still having a conversation, but right, it's a digital conversation. So um, as we all know, like through texting, folks, or even having a phone conversation, right? Things, some nuance can be lost in the conversation because you're not really you're not really seeing all the visual cues of talking to a person. So yes, they're less effective, but not to say that they're not effective because they're still generally effective because you're still having a conversation with them.
Now, one thing I've been reading a lot about is that the Republicans seem to be sort of outsourcing their canvassing ground campaign this cycle. Do you think that that's going to be an advantage for the Democrats?
I think that can be a small advantage for the Democrats. So, as someone who uh, has worked also on a paid canvas, and so also there's like differences, right? Most typical campaigns run a lot of their stuff through a volunteer canvas, but that typically requires a lot of people like motivating and calling volunteers to get them scheduled, and depending on the campaign and the candidate, like that requires a lot of time and resources and people knowing who you are and the energy. So sometimes it's easier to do a paid canvas, and paid canvas is literally it's just you're paying someone to hopefully knock and on people's doors and talk to them about your campaign. Paid canvassing, I think, is typically seen as less effective because instead of passionate volunteers going out to outreach to different voters, it's people. It's the motivation's different. The motivation is to get paid, right?
You're probably reading from like a script, right?
Yeah,
Like
and
the folks
like
Elon is paying.
yes, and they might not have the heart. Granted, there are some people like that start off like in their career. Like my actually, well, technically, I did do a volunteer canvas like way back in high school, but like my first foray really into politics was actually being paid to canvas as a job, and so that is a potential opportunity to like get people like working on campaigns or dedicated, but for every like one, for every one person that is that kind of dedicated, you usually have like 1.5 to 2 people who are just in it for the money and they just want to like have a job, right? And I think what anecdotes and stories that we've seen about Elon Musk's America PAC is that because they're literally instead of being paid by a shift, which is a normal thing in a campaign, you get paid x x amount of dollars per hour, which is like a typical job. Like from what I can tell, they're literally being paid by the door, and so people are just rushing through their list and essentially, you know, faking some data and but just like dropping literature and dropping literature at someone's door is just as effective as sending someone literature at their mailbox.
Right.
So, but it's just more expensive too, because you're literally paying people per hour to drop literature and not even talk to people, as opposed to at least a mass mailer. You've got cost efficiencies by being able to like mail in bulk
Yeah.
to thousands of people instead of dozens of people.
So you brought up a list, right? So where do you get your list?
Yeah, so campaigns usually have a list. So uh, regardless of the campaign, there will be a file of voters. I think some people like misunderstand and stuff. Like all so who you vote for is obviously a secret. It is something that is private to you, but that your information that you are registered to vote and which elections you have voted, that is all public information. Granted, of course, if you are a private citizen and want to get that data from a county clerk, you can certainly get it. But you'll get this like mumble jumble of a mess of an Excel spreadsheet that is hard to decipher. But campaigns, of course, because they usually have like third party companies that are help support him to like build these databases. They usually have a robust data file in a database of who all the voters are, and then through that list, then they can segment and target. And I don't want to like go like super wonky into detail, but generally they parse through, basically based on like, zip code, uh, gender, and your party affiliation, and when and how many times you voted in the past. But there's also like sophisticated tools that different organizations have that basically also kind of like buy. Basically, they buy a lot of data points to like potentially target and like kind of come up with some sort of like score to see how likely you are to be like supportive of different issues or supportive of the potential party or something like that. Again, that's like way in the weeds, but basically that's kind of how a list comes about. Is the party essentially, or the organization, if you're talking about like a ballot measure or um, some sort of like non-party kind of like a nonprofit who wants to talk about their specific issue, typically they will, yeah, basically they have a list of folks. They have an inkling of who they want to reach out to in certain points of time, and then based on that they will cut a list, and then for of course they can use that list to do like phone banking if they have numbers for you. And then they also can cut a list, based on geography. And usually they try to have like a dense enough geography that people aren't, typically the reason why you see a lot of canvassers in like kind of urban and suburban areas, right, is because it's easier for people to like talk to like 30, 25, 30, 40, to like knock on 25, 30, or 40 doors an hour in those areas, as opposed to in a more rural or sparse area, or an area that doesn't have a lot of supporters, where you might be like literally having there's sometimes like literally you have to like drive from door to door, which obviously is even less effective. But yeah.
So you brought up an interesting point where the county clerk has public data, and then various campaigns can take that data and put it into a database. Now they know my political affiliation, whether or not I voted. Can they buy, say, advertiser data? Right? We've
Yes.
heard stories about how a woman found out she was pregnant based on what the ads were, based on the things that she was buying. I can't speak to the veracity of that, but we've heard similar stories. Do campaigns buy advertiser data to build more sophisticated models so that they could say, oh yes, Justin White, he is this level of income, this education, this ethnicity, so on and so forth, and come up with something really sophisticated?
Depends on the campaign, but yes, there are different firms that like people that the campaigns buy the data from, and of course, this is on both major political parties. I've seen other like nonprofits and folks use it. So um, on the Democratic side, one of the major ones is Catalyst, but they're not the only one. But essentially, yes, there are obviously the reason why a lot of stuff is free or have a freemium model, right? Is essentially um, to get that more free, you are giving them your data. Unfortunately, whether you like it or not, and that is pulled into with other data, and basically, yeah, there are files. I'm certain, like there are specific ways people have targeted me because they know I subscribe to a certain magazine, or I've shopped for specific things at Target and stuff like that. So, yes, I mean that is the reality. Is that, yeah, a lot of campaigns. I mean, again, it really depends on the campaign, and I will honestly say that like it is sophisticated, but it's not foolproof. I have also, you know, had to work with. I mean, I didn't buy it myself, but like I've had to use, score filing itself on a previous campaign that I've worked on that was supposedly, targeting people that were more likely supportive of a certain issue. And while it generally was true, it was certainly not foolproof. I definitely talked to uh, people on that list who were definitely not supportive of that issue, which is fine. So yes, there's sophisticated modeling, but like anything else, like the data is only, it can only go so far. It doesn't actually
Yep.
tell who the person is, who actually is.
Correlations are never 100%, as
Yeah.
like the same political science. So the real question I'm sure most people who are watching are interested in is, so what's the mood like in Pennsylvania?
That is a really, really good question. I am, I honestly am hopeful. As someone who supports Kamala Harris and the Democratic ticket through my time in Pennsylvania. Granted, of course, caveat is that yes, I've canvassed like 5 to 6 different packets in different areas in South Central and Southeastern Pennsylvania, and of course, this is all anecdotal data. But from what I've seen, and I've done both, like in a kind of persuasion universe and in a more of a get out the vote stuff, I have seen real excitement for the Democratic ticket in the demographics that the Harris campaign would need to win.
So this is the Philadelphia area and suburbs surrounding?
Mostly, but also most recently I was in Harrisburg.
Oh, okay.
So that's in the 10th congressional district. So for your viewers and listeners who don't know, the 10th congressional district is Harrisburg and York, which is like about 2 hours west of Philadelphia and about an hour to hour and a half north of Baltimore.
Not too far from Gettysburg.
Yes, that area is a swing district. It is currently represented in Congress by Congressman Scott Perry. The Cook Political Report says it's a Republican +5 district, but Perry is getting a strong challenge right now because the Democratic challenger is Janelle Stelson, who is a former TV anchor and reporter who has been, a reporter for 30 years on TV. So she's well known, she's well liked, and she has raised a ton of money and Scott Perry was one of the architects of the January 6th.
Yeah, I think his
Stuff.
phone actually got taken by the FBI, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Correct. Yes.
So, okay, yeah, if the Democrats can't win that one, well,
I
they
mean,
should
I
just
mean,
give up.
I mean, it's again the Cook political, like it's an R+5 lean, uh, so it does lean Republican, but it is a right pickup opportunity because of that and because of all the money. And I will say that there is pretty decent support for Stelson from what I see in the different areas that I've been to. So for instance, in that district, I was in one weekend I was in York, and one weekend I was in Harrisburg. In Harrisburg, I was um, one of my tours was a kind of working class, mostly black, some Latino neighborhood. There is a very strong support for Kamala Harris. So I didn't see any. That's not to say that there isn't some slippage among some black voters, but I didn't see it on the ground. But of course, just because I don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. But I can tell you that black women, regardless of their income, are very motivated and very supportive of Kamala Harris, as you might expect. And even the younger black men that I talked to, which was just a few of them. So again, very, you can't really like parse out like too much of it, but at least from my experience, like they are also supporting Kamala. They might not be as enthusiastic as black women, but they are um, definitely on board. And then in York, I was in more of a and part of this is like I'm also a little bit of a nerd. So like in retrospect, I will actually go to like the New York Times election map from 2020 to be like, where did I canvass? How did I vote in 2020? And like, what was the shift from 2016? And I will say in York, Pennsylvania, the area that I talked to was definitely a lot more of a swing area. It was an area that voted for Trump by about I think around 15 to 20 points. But it did shift left. It was kind of an inner suburb of York, Pennsylvania, which is like a smaller city. And there, while people weren't like, the like super enthusiastic, people were fairly supportive. And that was my list had a lot more independents there, obviously, than like in East Harrisburg, which was basically I was just talking to Democrats and basically just trying to get them to have a vote plan. So in York, Pennsylvania, I definitely still got a lot of support. Granted, of course, there were definitely more undecideds, like of the independents I talked to in that area that I went to. There were definitely a couple that were supporting Kamala, a couple that said that they're undecided, but they were very receptive to my message. And there was one person who was voting for Trump, but he didn't say anything mean or hostile. He just said, we're a Republican household, and that was it. He didn't like slam the door in my face. He was nice about it, but he was just like, yeah, I'm not your target person.
Yeah, I
and
imagine
he,
most people would be
yeah,
nice. Yeah.
yeah, and he was a Latino male.
So, we've, had a lot of discussions about independence, on the podcast. You know, how would you describe them? Do they have any coherent political view, or are they just really uninformed in your experience? How would you describe them?
I think, I mean, for a lot of people who follow politics, this is kind of um, more of. Anyways, I'm gonna say that like there's not really a really coherence in terms of like people who are independent, because the reason why they're independent are just various different reasons. A person who is independent in York, Pennsylvania is even different from a person who was independent in um, where was it? In Wallingford, Pennsylvania. And Wallingford is a very well-to-do upper middle class to upper class, predominantly white suburb of Philadelphia. And all those independents I talked to in Wallingford, they were very supportive of Kamala Harris. But, those independents, right, are probably people who used to be like maybe McCain Romney Republicans and have become independents over time, as opposed to independents in York, Pennsylvania, who could have used to be Union Democrats who no longer affiliate with Democrats but aren't quite Republicans. And of course, there are younger people who are like F both parties, but lean more, progressive or left on issues, but they're still like F both parties, so I'll be independent. So like what it means to be independent is like kind of all over the place and really depends on like the geography, demographic, and of the area.
That makes sense.
One thing that's sort of caught my attention the past week is I don't know if you're watching the ads that Senator Casey put out in Pennsylvania that was sort of identifying with Trump and some Trump policies. And to me, that signals he doesn't think he's going to get enough Harris voters to win. How would you react to something like that? Do you think that that's something that kind of reflects at all what you saw, or just maybe desperation on his part, or maybe I'm misreading it? I don't know.
I even despite the fact that I did spend some time in my hotel room watching network news, I didn't see that ad. But I will say that I do think it is smart, and it's smart for a couple reasons. One, he doesn't necessarily need to win with like getting more Trump voters, but it is probably a lot more helpful. And the reason why I say that is that there will be places like in Northeast Pennsylvania, probably places that are more blue collar, working to middle class, former industrial union towns that have moved towards Trump and the Republican Party, but have historic roots and like really trust the Casey. The Casey name, has been in Pennsylvania politics for quite a while. I mean, Bob Casey is the son of, I think his father, right, was both a governor and a senator. I don't know quite the details, but clearly he comes from like a political family that has strong tradition, especially strong union traditions. In Pennsylvania. So I do think that's A, smart in that aspect, and B, I'll be honest, there probably are some Harris McCormick voters. People, and those are probably people that are in more affluent, whiter suburban areas of Philadelphia, maybe parts of Pittsburgh. People who are disgusted by Donald Trump, right? And not to say that they don't like Bob Casey, right? But McCormick is much more aligned with them in terms of being a very like business friendly Republican, kind of more in the mold of Pat Toomey, who was, a previous senator that, is very much in the past. If you know about Pat Toomey, is very much like what stuff with a very like business friendly climate, the Chamber of Commerce, Club for Growth, type of thing.
Yeah, when we analyzed McCormick, we basically said, he has the exact resume you would want for someone running for political office in the old Republican Party. He's a very good candidate, and honestly, had the Republicans, chosen him instead of Dr. Oz, I don't think you'd see John Fetterman in the Senate. So, I think Casey has his work cut out for him.
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, I do think that it is still Casey's race to lose, like because there will probably be some Trump Casey voters or people who are frankly like just leave the top of the ballot blank, but also like really support Bob Casey. So I do think it's for him to lose because I will say that I did not. There are only very certain parts of Pennsylvania that I saw had both Trump and McCormick signs. Usually, it was either Trump or McCormick, and you could
Interesting.
really and like so in York, Pennsylvania, any sign that was Republican was a Trump sign. There was no David McCormick signs to be found in a place like York, Pennsylvania, which is again a more blue collar,
Right.
Smaller city in like South Central Pennsylvania, as opposed to like when I start getting into the suburbs of Pennsylvania and like kind of the more outer suburban parts, I did see some both Trump and McCormick signs, like when I was around like Powley and stuff. But when I got closer in, for instance, not Upper Darby, but like if I was like near Ardmore, which is a very very close in suburb that's like within a few miles of Philadelphia, that's where I basically saw no Trump signs at all. And if there were any Republican signs, which were maybe like two or three, they were Dave McCormick signs. So it's a very different, like, if you were supporting a Republican, there was at least from my anecdotal evidence, there were very few that had both that were so enthusiastic to like have both a McCormick and a Trump sign on their lawn.
Interesting. So it sounds like you're seeing like the never Trumpers versus the hardcore MAGAs then.
Yeah.
Okay. So, John, thank you so much for your
Yep.
time and insight. It's been really helpful. And honestly, I think, the way you've described everything in Pennsylvania, um, you know, I think that Democrats can feel a little less anxious, but they should still be on edge. I think that's kind of the vibe I'm getting from you.
That's probably not likely among the Democratic section of voters. Anxiety, I think, is sort of a built-in function of the Democratic Party, at least in the last few elections.
Yes, I will agree with Jonathan. I think part of the pivot right with Democrats getting a lot more college educated, especially college educated young voters, is that many of us, not all of us, right, but many of us are very online, riding the roller coaster and very anxious all the time. And what I can say to that is that if you're anxious, go volunteer, go talk to voters. Don't don't go on like Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, being anxious all the time. Just, talk to voters themselves. And in fact, not only is it helpful to like hear what voters have to say or like try to get voters who haven't voted to like turn out, because honestly, it is like late October. So if you're a Democrat and you're volunteering now, the chances that you'll be talking to like an undecided or like a swing voter is very minimal. Not to say it doesn't exist, but it's very low chances, because what it is now essentially is to turn out. So yeah, I would just like go be like, I mean, granted, of course, it's easy for me to say as someone who literally does this a lot and will take basically the next week and a half to go out to canvass. Like I will be in Arizona this weekend. I will be in Southern California. Yes, to see family. Yes, to vote because I'm still registered in San Diego. But also to canvass for swing congressional races down in Orange County. And I'll be in Nevada. But basically, if you want to cure your anxiety, go volunteer. Talk to voters, get your mind off of it, and be like, not only are you trying to get people to like turn out and you'll know actually what voters think, but you might even persuade a couple other people to be voting for Harris Walls or whoever other candidate that you are canvassing and volunteering for.
I think that is a great message to end on. I really do appreciate you coming out and joining us tonight. Go get some sleep, and then good luck with the rest of your canvassing.
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to talk to y'all.
All right. Hope to talk again. Take care.
Take care.
Okay, so let's move on to discussing the House race. So, as we all know from our civics class, the House is reelected in full every 2 years, and we redistrict every 10 years. So, 2020 was when we had the redistricting, and 2022 was when we had the first elections with the new districts formed.
Just in case anybody is not as up to date on that, redistricting just means drawing new boundaries for congressional districts. And why we do it every 10 years is it ties into the census. So when the census comes out, they do a recalculation, decide, oh, you've lost a seat. Oh, this state, you've gained 2 seats, right? So then they have to carve up the states into new congressional districts based on how much population they've gained, lost, or stayed the same.
Right. And it's important to note that the states themselves are the ones who draw the districts. Now, some states will have the state legislatures draw the districts, and they will try to gerrymander them in such a way that they have significant advantage. Other states will have independent redistricting commissions that will draw the districts in a fair manner. So, what happened between 2020 and 2022? Well, the general trend was that the Republicans were able to take a lot of the toss-up seats and turn them into safe Republican districts. So, for instance, if you were a Republican in, say, Florida, and you had like a 2-point margin of victory in 2020, well, in 2022 you might be at a plus 10, right? And then so the Democrats, I would say they got screwed in that area a little bit, at least relative to 2020.
I think it's sort of a realistic assessment of the gerrymandering is that Democrats just aren't as motivated. They're not as good at it. The Republicans are much better in saying, you know what, we're going to nakedly change as many of these districts to be good for us as we can, because the Supreme Court has kind of stepped back and decided, hey, that's a political thing. They can do what they want. But a number of the Democratic states where they could do this have built in recently passed laws that say you can't. So like New York got in trouble for trying to gerrymander too many districts. In Colorado, we now have a redistricting commission, like you mentioned, where they're prevented from doing naked partisan gerrymandering for the redistricting. Otherwise, with majorities in both state houses and a Democratic governor in Colorado, they could have probably made it so there was maybe one Republican district if they really felt like it. But the Republicans don't have that in most of the states where they are redistricting, so they're not bound by these sort of parameters. And as we know, political norms have kind of gone out of fashion in a lot of circles these days.
Yeah, I think the one caveat to that is that the Supreme Court has stepped in for certain states in the
Only
South,
when they
right?
say it, only when they think there's a racial motive behind it.
Exactly. And in states like, say, Alabama, Mississippi, the Democratic Party and the black vote are inextricably linked, right? And so you can't just say, oh, we're doing it for the Democrats. The Supreme Court says, no, 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 no. Historically speaking, that is, you're affecting, African Americans. Whereas in a state like Arizona, where you don't have that history, the Supreme Court has said, yeah, you can use, partisan gerrymandering. That's fine.
Which
So
I still have a hard time coming to terms with that, because basically they're saying if you win power, you can lock your opponents out of power. And it just, that logic to me is not logic that I would support if I happen to have any influence with the Supreme Court.
Sure, it's certainly not fair, but I don't think the Supreme Court
cares
talking about they don't care about fairness. What they care about is, are you violating the Civil Rights Act? At least that's what the cases have been like. So let's talk about the 2024 race. If you look at all the safe Republican seats and compare them to the safe Democratic seats, you'll see that the Republicans have like a 10 to 15 seat advantage right there. And if you start adding in likely Republican, and what I mean by that is, they have like an 80% chance to win, or, they're likely to have like a 6 to 8 point margin of victory, they're already at 200 plus seats. And you only need 213 seats to have an outright majority. So just if you remove all the toss-ups and the leaning,
I think it's 218 actually. because there's 435 seats.
Yes, my math was wrong. Shoot.
The engineer deferring the math to the professor.
Yes,
Just
218.
In any case, yeah, I think you're right. And what it comes down to is the Democrats are kind of playing catch up, right?
Yeah.
But fortunately for the Democrats, there are enough toss-up seats that if they were to sweep the toss-up seats, they're going to win. Whether they can sweep the toss-up seats is another story. And I think that we've picked out some interesting races that will kind of give us and our viewers some insight into where we think the House race might be going.
Right. And so when it comes to the toss-ups, you did say that the Democrats did pretty well in 2022 by winning a majority of them. But where they kind of got screwed was in states like California and New York, where abortion laws are protected in those states. And so you kind of had that midterm backlash in those states where, things aren't going particularly well with inflation, and the Democratic incumbents, just didn't do as well as they could. As a matter of fact, the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Committee lost, which is really embarrassing. He lost in New York.
And I believe both those states, both New York and your state of California, have parameters about redistricting, so they can't just be naked partisan redistricting. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
That's what I thought.
So yeah, I found that really interesting because the Democrats had a lot of things going for them with like the abortion laws being overturned, and that being like a motivator for voters versus like the inflation aspect. And so, they did much better than expected in 2022. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of these specific districts that are going to really tell us, they're going to give us insight into where the race is going.
And we're going to be a little provincial because Justin is going to talk about a California district and I have a Colorado district on tap. But both of these, I think, are really illustrative of what's going on in the country.
Right. So California 13 has a freshman GOP congressman. So he won his election for the first time, and he's running for re-election for the first time.
And for our viewers and listeners not familiar with California, where is California 13?
Yeah, so California 13 is in the Central Valley. His district is north of Fresno, and it's fairly rural.
Okay, so in the eastern part of California, then, right?
Yeah, central.
Okay,
yeah,
but not on the coast, not LA.
No, definitely not on the coast. And the reason why I chose this district is because it is 66% Hispanic. Now, one of the things that you might have heard is that Trump is doing better with Hispanics than, say, Mitt Romney did or John McCain did. And so the signal I'm looking for here is, even though Democrats are winning Hispanics by like a 2-1 margin or like a 60-40 margin, what I'm looking for is this trend continuing, right? So there's an incumbency factor with House members where you will have a greater chance of winning if you're an incumbent, just because people know who you are. You have that name recognition. And so I just want to compare that with, the underlying demographics and see where things go.
And what is the consensus of how that race is? Is there polling in that race?
It looks to be lean Democrat, or not lean Democrat. It's a toss-up, but the Democrat, Adam Gray, he's winning about 2 points versus this guy. And, it's interesting because the way they're campaigning, it's just focusing on like farming, water, just things you would expect in like a rural area, especially in California, right, where we've had droughts. They're running very similar campaigns. I think what's interesting about Adam Gray is that he's also adding the healthcare component to it, because that's a strong issue for Democrats, right?
Sure. Okay. So over in Colorado, where I am, Colorado 8, which is sort of a suburban Denver kind of area, right, is interesting to me, and also to a number of commentators in Colorado, right, because it looks very much like a sort of a microcosm of what's going on in the country at large. In Colorado, as I mentioned before, we have a redistricting commission, so they're tasked with having so many strong Democrat and strong Republican seats, and so many toss-ups. This one was created as a competitive district, and it was a competitive district the last time around. I believe the incumbent won by somewhere around 2,000 votes or less. It was a very, very small margin, right? And the Democratic Republic incumbent, Yadira Caraveo, is running again against this guy, Josh Evans, who's more or less a MAGA guy. He was not supported. The state party supported his opponent in the Republican primary, but he won anyway. So what you see here is another true toss-up. And it's going to be a close race. It's rated as a close race. And so all of us in the Denver metro area are being flooded with these commercials that both sides are running, right? And there's something like $20 million of super PAC money, $20 million already spent, 15 million of it coming from super PACs. So people outside the state say, hey, this is an important opportunity for both of us to pick something up, right? And we're seeing ads all the time, everywhere, no matter what. It's interesting what you see, because from Caraveo, you see stuff stressing that her bipartisan approach, touting her background as an MD. She's a doctor. She's got stuff about, right, not talking about being a Democrat very much. She's never talking about Kamala Harris, right? So to me, that's like a sign that, you know what? She's not confident that Harris helps her out at all. And clearly she's not, or she'd be talking about her. It's sort of a warning sign, kind of like what we see in the country, that Harris is not pulling away. And you need to appeal to other voters, if you're Caraveo, to pull votes away from her Republican opponent. And she's doing that by trying to hit him hard on abortion rights. She had a sheriff endorse her and this kind of thing. In terms of what Evans is doing, he is taking basically the standard MAGA approach, right? He's a former, I believe, an Army veteran and a police officer. So he's touting that left and right. He's surrounded by anonymous law enforcement officers in a lot of different ads, right? He has been waffling a bit on his anti-abortion stance, but largely avoiding that, right? He doesn't want to make that the issue. But what he's doing is he's doing typical MAGA fashion and kind of making stuff up and throwing it at the wall and hoping it fits. He has ads that call Caraveo a liar for claiming to be bipartisan and a liberal extremist and all this. He really is kind of focusing on the border crisis, and has ads where he says she's responsible for it all, which was quite an interesting revelation to me. I didn't realize that a junior congresswoman from Colorado could be responsible for all of the policy that we have at the border, but there we go. And he's also claiming that she's decriminalized fentanyl, which can't be true because we haven't decriminalized fentanyl. But both of these dueling campaign styles are effective for reaching their bases, and that's why we have a toss-up race right now, right? It could go either way, which, again, for me, this is really a microcosm of what's going on in the country.
Yeah, it's actually kind of surprising how this guy seems fairly MAGA aligned, right? And you just wouldn't think to have someone like that as a candidate in a swing district.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the same respect, though, Donald Trump is pretty MAGA aligned, and he's appealing pretty well in the swing states.
Right.
Right. So again, it's sort of like if you take the national race and compress it down to one district, this is kind of what we have going on in the Colorado 8th.
Yeah, but I do think Trump is fairly unique. I feel like yeah, but I feel like most people who try to imitate Trump just fall on their face.
Yes, he doesn't have anywhere near the I guess the charisma and appeal that Trump has. He's the ads are kind of like kind of cringy, but
right. There's
enough support for him. At least there's enough opposition, I guess, to vote to the Democrat that people are considering him. So it will be interesting to see how that race goes. It would not surprise me if that race goes the same way as the presidential race.
Yeah, definitely. So the next race I want to talk about is New York 17, which is, if you know New York, it's basically north of Yonkers. It's a fairly suburban, urban, densely populated. district, and it has a large Jewish population of roughly 25%. And within the Jewish demographic, it's not just your typical, we'll call them your liberal Jews, which is the vast majority of them in this country. It has a large Orthodox as well as Hasidic community as well. So it's a very diverse Jewish community.
Yeah. So not New York City per se, but
Right.
but in the general vicinity.
Exactly. And this race is rated as lean Republican, which means you kind of expect the guy, the incumbent, to win, maybe by somewhere between 3 to 4 points, maybe 3 to 6 points. But I find him interesting because he's trying to play both sides with Republicans, right? He wants to be aligned with Trump enough where he's not going to get in trouble, but he also needs to have that flexibility to appeal to a fairly educated population. And so my take on this race is if he wins this race as a freshman incumbent, then he's probably going to be sailing to victory for the next, X amount of years until we redistrict again, right? Because once you win your first re-election, you just have such powerful name recognition that it just becomes, you have to basically do something that will cause you to lose, right?
Unless he gets primaried on the right.
Right. Which I really don't think that could happen in a district like this, right? Now on the other side is Mondaire Jones. And so it was really interesting here because Mondaire Jones was the congressman of this district in 2020, but due to the redistricting and the fact that New York lost districts, Maloney, who was the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Caucus, so in leadership, he said, "Hey, Jones, you got to get out of here. I'm running in this district." And then he lost. And Mondaire Jones was someone who ran on the whole Black Lives Matter, Green New Deal, Medicare for all. So basically a very strong progressive. Now, is he running that race now? Absolutely not. He is basically taking the Kamala Harris approach. Kamala Harris tried to paint herself as a progressive when she ran for president in the 2020 primary, and she has shifted to the right considerably in order to win a general election. Now, whether or not that strategy works, well, we'll find out in 2 weeks. But I found it interesting that Jones is basically following in her footsteps, right? And he's running on Biden's record because he was in Congress from 2020 to 2022, which is when most of Biden's agenda was passed. So he's saying, hey, look at all the stuff I did. I was a part of this. And then he's also saying,
in a lot of ways, this is kind of like an old school congressional district, right? Where people, both parties have sort of incentive to go to the extremes to get to be the nominees, but then come back to the center for the general elections. And in a lot of districts, we don't see that anymore because gerrymandering has been so successful in creating safe seats, right? You need to pull out your partisans. Whereas if you're in a competitive district, you got to appeal to people that aren't as partisan to win your race.
Right. So he's running on Biden's record, say things like the CHIPS Act, the infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, those sort of things. He's also explicitly saying, hey, I stood up to the squad. I condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, right? Makes sense because it's 25% Jewish, and I have to imagine that demographic is going to determine the winner. And he also supports the border bill that, as we discussed in previous podcasts, is a fairly tough border bill. And so he recognizes that immigration, especially in New York, where a lot of migrants have been bused, it's become a really salient issue. And the reality is that a lot of progressive people and Democrats in general have had to move to the right on immigration because that's what the population wants.
Yeah, I think all three of these races would kind of be interesting to watch for different reasons, right? Like you said, the California race, it'll be interesting to see what's going on with Hispanic voters, right? In the Colorado race, as I mentioned, it's kind of the toss-up swing state kind of thing that is going to show us probably later in the evening, but going to show us what's, the similar kind of dynamics that we're going to see in the swing states. And then the New York race is kind of like, it sort of warms my heart as a classic political race where people go to the extremes in the primaries but come back in the general election. And we'll see if that still holds any kind of appeal for voters.
Yeah. And then the last race, I'm just going to mention this briefly, is Nebraska 2. So we mentioned before that Nebraska allocates their electoral votes based on congressional district, at least the three of them. And then whoever wins statewide gets the other two. Harris is expected to win Nebraska 2 by like 8 points. We can basically say it's a lean Democrat / likely Democrat electoral vote. Now, Don Bacon is a incumbent Republican, and he's also winning there too. And so I found that really interesting, right? Because it's split ticket voting. You're definitely going to have people voting for Don Bacon who are also voting for Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. We're in an era where split ticket voting is decreasing. So I just wanted to point that out, that Nebraska 2 is going to be really interesting because maybe we're going to see a resurgence in split ticket voting.
Well, I mean, and John Tester in Montana certainly hopes so, right? There's no chance that Trump is going to lose in Montana. The one thing that the Democrats have in their favor for something like that in Montana, but Republicans have in their favor for something like Nebraska, is what happened in Georgia most recently, right? In 2020. There were Trump voters who voted for a Democratic senator. So it's interesting to see this play out more extreme in Nebraska too. And John Tester in Montana is really hoping that plays out in Montana, as are Democrats nationwide, because if he loses, it's going to be a really tough task for Democrats to maintain control of the Senate.
Yeah, and it could also be an example of half split ticket voting, right? Where you vote for the Republican for Congress, but you leave the presidential ballot blank, or vote for a third party.
Although I think in presidential races, I think that's less common. It's more uncommon. It's more common to vote for the president and leave the other things blank. But yeah, all these are possibilities.
Yeah, we live in interesting times.
So that kind of wraps it up for the week. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the interview. I really enjoyed being able to talk with Jon, and I really want to thank him again for coming in and spending some time with us. Next week, we'll jump right back into the anxiety. Hopefully you have some Xanax on hand to kind of tide you over until then. If not, 8% beer does the trick too. On that note, I think we're going to be signing off, and we will see you next week.
All right. Bye-bye.